Maryjane's journey began in the crowded chaos of Lagos, a city bustling with life yet steeped in struggle. The market was alive with noise, traders shouting, children laughing, and horns blaring. Maryjane weaved through the crowd, her bag of groceries heavy in her hand. She paused at the vendor's stall, her eyes catching a travel poster. Europe. The Eiffel Tower gleamed against a backdrop of blue skies, felt like a distant dream. She stared at it for a long moment, her heart aching with a mixture of longing and frustration. She let out a sigh, imagining herself in a world far removed from her reality. The thought was interrupted by the vendor's voice. "Madam, you like am? This Europe na fine place oh. Better life dey there well well." Maryjane smiled faintly, shaking her head as she moved on. If only it were that simple. Her home was a cramped apartment in a decaying building that had seen better days decades ago. The paint on the wall was peeling, the smell of dampness lingering no matter how long and how much they cleaned. Her father, a retired civil servant, sat on the only armchair in their tiny living room, scanning an old newspaper as if searching for something long lost. "Maryjane," he began, his voice heavy with weariness. "Education is the key. You have your degree. Keep applying for jobs. Something will come." She didn't have the heart to tell him how much those words stung. She had graduated top of her class in finance, the shining star of their family, the hope that would leave them out of poverty. But Lagos had no room for her dreams. Job rejections came like clockwork, each one crushing her spirit a little more. She decided to join her mother in the kitchen, stirring the pot of soup that barely masks the smell of smoke from their kerosene stove. Her mother's hands moved with mechanical precision, but the lines on her face told the story of a woman who had long since resigned herself to life's disappointments. "Don't let your father hear you complain," her mother said softly, not looking up. "It will break his heart. He believes in you, Maryjane." Maryjane bit her lip, forcing back the words she wanted to scream. She couldn't let them down, not after all the sacrifices they had made. But each day felt like a cruel joke. Her once bright future now dimmed by the weight of unmet expectations. The bathroom in the house was perhaps the worst of it. Shared with 5 other tenants, it was a breeding ground of mildew and despair. The cracked tiles glistened with moisture, and the toilet leaked relentlessly, its stench mingling with the humid air. Maryjane crushed over a plastic bucket, scrubbing her clothes with raw hands, her fingers pruned from the harsh detergent. The rhythmic sound of her scrubbing was the only noise in the otherwise suffocating silence of her thoughts. Derek, her boyfriend of 3 years, was her only solace. His tiny flat wasn't much better than hers, but it was a refuge where she could breathe, even if for a little while. He was a school teacher, passionate but woefully underpaid. His walls were adorned with certificates, proud reminders of his small victories in a system that offered very little reward. "We'll get through this, Maryjane," Derek said one evening, his arm draped around her shoulders as they sat on his threadbare couch. "I will marry you one day, and we will build a life together." She wanted to believe him, but as she looked around at his cramped space, the peeling paint and the faint smell of dampness, she felt her chest tighten. Love was not enough to fix leaking roof or fill empty stomachs. The final rejection letter came a week later. She tore it into tiny pieces, her frustration spilling over as she threw the shredded paper to the ground. Derek tried to console her, his voice gentle, but she pulled away, the tears in her eyes a mixture of rage and despair. "I can't live like this anymore, Derek," she said, her heart and her voice breaking. I need more. We deserve more. The encounter at the salon happened by chance. Maryjane had gone to retouch her hair, seeking a semblance of confidence in a world that seemed intent on breaking her. That was where she met Soji. He was a man of presence, with a gold chain that glinted against his broad chest and a voice that commanded attention. "You've got potential, Maryjane," he said, his smile equal parts charm and calculation. "Europe will give you everything you've ever dreamed of. Just say the word." She hesitated, unsure of whether to laugh at his audacity or consider the offer. She had heard the stories of women leaving for greener pastures only to find themselves trapped in nightmares. But then, she thought of the cramped apartments, the leaking toilets, the weight of her parents' expectations, and Derrick's promise that no longer seemed to hold meaning. The temptation was overwhelming. She sat at the edge of her rickety bed, the springs creaking against her weight. In her hands, she held the gold-edged card that had seemed like a lifeline just yesterday. Now, it felt more like a warning. At the time, she had laughed it off, but as her family's situation grew desperate, Soji's offer began to fester in her mind. She had no job. She had finished her OND 2 years ago, but there were no openings anywhere. Even the retail shops wanted experiences that she didn't have. Every interview ended with the same polite rejection, and she always returned home to her mother's disappointed eyes. After her morning routine, she headed to Soji's office, tracing her way from the card he had handed her. She didn't know what she expected, but the building was unremarkable. Its paint peeling and its sign faded from years of sun exposure. Inside, however, it was a different world. The air conditioning was a sharp contrast to the sweltering Lagos heat, and the plush carpeting felt alien under her feet. Soji sat behind a massive wooden desk, his rotund figure partially hidden behind its bulk. He smiled as if he's been expecting her. "Maryjane," he said, his voice smoother than it had been in the salon. "You have come to make a good decision." She hesitated, clutching her handbag tightly. "I just came to ask some questions," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Of course," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "Ask anything you want." Soji launched into his speech, detailing how he could get her to Italy. "I have connections," he said, leaning forward as if sharing a secret. "You work hard, yes, but you make good money. Enough to send home, enough to save. In a few years, you can come back and build your own house. Buy your parents a very fine house." "How much does it cost?" Maryjane asked cautiously. Soji's smile widened, revealing gums stained dark by years of chewing cola nuts. 50,000 euros, he said, as if it were a bargain. "But don't worry, you'll pay it back in installments once you start working." The number hit her like a physical blow. 50,000 euros. She couldn't even imagine such an amount. "If I had that kind of money," she said, her voice trembling with anger, "I wouldn't even leave Nigeria. I would take care of my family here." Soji laughed, a deep throaty sound that made her skin crawl. "Ah, my dear, you are thinking short term. This is an investment. When you get there, you'll see. Italy is the place to be." That night, she sat on her bed, staring at the plane tickets Soji had given her. Her reflection in the cracked mirror showed a face etched with fear and a flicker of hope. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of a different life. Maryjane's arrival in Italy was nothing like she had envisioned. The biting cold greeted her as she stepped off the plane, a stark contrast to the humid chaos of Lagos. She wrapped her thin coat tightly around herself and followed the man Soji had arranged to meet her, a burly figure with a gruff demeanor. The drive to her new home was silent, except for the sound of the tires on wet pavement. Maryjane stared out at the streets, mesmerized by the unfamiliar sights, clean sidewalks, orderly traffic, and towering buildings. It looked like a dream, but something was unsettling about it. Too quiet, too sterile. She was far from home in every possible sense. The house was a cramped building in a nondescript part of the city. She was ushered inside, her suitcase dragging behind her, and met by three women seated around the small table in a dimly lit living room. Goldie was the first to speak, her sharp features and confident posture making her look unshakable. "New girl, huh? Welcome to the club." Joyce, soft-spoken and reserved, offered a polite nod, while Muna, older and nurturing, extended a hand and a small smile. "Don't mind Goldie. She comes on strong. You'll get used to it here." Maryjane didn't understand what it was until later that evening. After dinner, the women began to prepare for what they called the walk. She watched in confusion as they applied makeup and donned flashy, revealing clothes. Goldie caught her staring. "What? You think we are here for sightseeing?" The bitterness in her voice was palpable. Mona stepped in to explain gently. "Soji didn't tell you everything, did he? This is how we survive, oh. We work. We pay off our debts, and maybe one day we will go home." Maryjane's stomach churned. This wasn't what she signed up for. She protested, tears swelling in her eyes. "I didn't come here for this. I thought I'd find the job. A real job." Joyce spoke for the first time, her voice quiet but firm. "That's what we all thought." The days turned into a blur of survival. Each night, Maryjane forced herself to step out into the freezing streets, wearing the marks of someone stronger than she felt. She avoided eye contact, numbing herself to the indignities she endured. Her letters home were filled with lies. "Mama, I'm doing well. Europe is beautiful. I'll send money soon. Tell Papa not to worry." She couldn't bear the thought of her parents knowing the truth, of seeing the disappointment in their eyes. The house was a strange kind of sanctuary. Despite their struggles, the women found ways to support one another. Goldie's brash humor brought moments of laughter. Joyce, though quiet, was a calming presence, and Mona, ever motherly, often stayed up late with Maryjane, listening to her fears and offering quiet reassurances. Yet, even with their companionship, Maryjane felt trapped, the walls of the house closing in on her. One night, as she stood by the window, staring at the twinkling city lights, she let herself dream again. What if she could escape? What if she could save enough money to leave this life behind and start over? The thought was a spark in the darkness, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a flicker of hope. But hope was a dangerous thing. Yet, Ashewo no be work. Maryjane's plan began to take shape in the quiet hours of the night, when the house was still and her thoughts were loud. She started to save, setting aside as much as she could from what little she earned. She watched and waited, looking for the right moment to slip away unnoticed. She confided in Mona, the only one she could trust enough to share her secrets. "I can't stay here, Mona. I need to leave. If I stay, I'll lose myself completely." Mona sighed, her face heavy with the weight of her own experiences. "My sister, I understand you, but living is not as easy as you think. Soji has eyes everywhere. He will not let you go without a fight." "I am willing to take that risk," Maryjane replied, her voice firm despite the fear that clawed at her insides. "I have to try." Mona nodded reluctantly, promising to help her when the time came. Together, they mapped out a plan. Maryjane would save enough money to buy a fake passport and a bus ticket to another city far away that Soji's rich wouldn't find her easily. Mona even gave her a contact, a woman who had escaped years ago and now lived quietly, far from the life they were trapped in. The days leading up to her planned escape was agonizing slowly. Every sound, every glance from the other women in the house made her paranoid. She avoided Goldie, whose sharp tongue and loyalty to Soji made her a potential threat. Joyce, though quiet and unassuming, seemed to sense something was amiss. "You've been quiet," Joyce remarked one evening, her eyes narrowing, more quiet than usual. "Be careful, Maryjane. Sometimes silence is what gets you noticed." The night finally came. Maryjane packed her meager belongings in a small bag, careful not to make a sound. Mona hugged her tightly before she left, whispering, "Be safe, Maryjane. Don't look back." The words stuck in her mind as she stepped out into the cold, dark streets, her heart pounding with fear and anticipation. She made her way to the train station, clutching her bag like a lifeline. The platform was nearly empty, the distant hums of train filling the silence. She checked the time repeatedly, her anxiety building with every passing second. Just a few more minutes, she told herself. A few more minutes and I'll be free. But freedom was not waiting for her. The sound of approaching footsteps made her freeze. She turned to see two men walking towards her, their faces shadowed but their intentions clear. Her heart sank as one of them stepped into the light. "Soji." "Maryjane, Maryjane," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Did you think you could run? Did you think I wouldn't find out?" She tried to speak, to explain, but the words caught in her throat. Soji's expression hardened as he stepped closer, his presence suffocating. "You belong to me," he hissed. "You don't get to leave." The scene blurred as panic set in. Maryjane tried to fight, to run, but the men closed in, their grip unrelenting. The last thing she saw before everything went dark was the train pulling into the station, a cruel reminder of the freedom she would never reach. Back at the house, the women sat in silence, the air heavy with dread. Madame, their overseer, entered the room, her face a mask of indifference. "Maryjane is gone," she sounded and announced flatly. "She made a mistake. She paid the price." Mona's hands trembled as she clutched one of Maryjane's sketches, a delicate drawing of a house surrounded by flowers. Tears swelled in her eyes as she whispered, she wanted more from life. She deserved more. The city lights outside the windows flickered, indifferent to the tragedy that had unfolded. Maryjane's story, like so many others, will fade into the shadows, a cautionary tale for those who dare to dream. The days that followed Maryjane's disappearance were heavy with an unspoken grief. In the house, the women moved like ghosts, their routines mechanical, their laughter extinguished. Mona sat by the window most nights, staring out at the city lights Maryjane used to dream of. She held onto Maryjane's sketch, running her fingers over the faint pencil lines. It was a simple drawing, but it held so much hope, longing, a fragile determination to escape the life they all despised. Goldie, usually flary and sharp-tongued, had grown quieter. She glanced at the door often, as if expecting Maryjane to walk back in, but she never said a word about it. Joyce, too, kept her head low, her eyes darting to Mona whenever the silence stretched too long. It was Mona who eventually broke it. "She didn't deserve this," Mona said one evening, her voice trembling with suppressed anger. "None of us do." Goldie, leaning against the counter with her arms crossed, scoffed. "You think you're saying something new? We all know this life isn't fair. Maryjane made a mistake. She should have known better." "She was desperate," Mona shot back, her tongue sharper than usual. "And don't pretend like you haven't thought about it too. Every one of us has. We all want out." The room felt silent again, but Mona's words lingered. They were true, and everyone knew it. They had all dreamed of freedom, but fear and the weight of their circumstances kept them chained. Maryjane's death was a brutal reminder of what happened to those who dared to break free. The next day, Mona made her way to a small church at the edge of the city. It was quiet, almost empty, save for a few scattered worshippers. She lit a candle for Maryjane, bowing her head as tears streamed down her face. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I should have done more. I should have stopped you. But I won't let your story end here." From that day forward, Mona began to plan. She didn't know how or when, but she knew she couldn't stay silent anymore. Maryjane's story deserved to be told, not just to honor her, but to shine a light on the countless others like her, women who had been lured by promises of a better life, only to find themselves trapped in a cruel and unforgiving world. Mona began writing, pouring her heart into letters and stories that she sent anonymously to journalists and advocacy groups. She detailed the horrors they endured, the lies they had been told, and the dreams that had been crushed. It was risky, and she knew it, but it was the only way she could make sense of the guilt and grief that consumed her. Weeks turned into months, and slowly whispers began to circulate. Articles appeared in local papers, exposing the networks that exploited vulnerable women. Activists began to rally, calling for investigations and justice. It wasn't much, but it was a start. One night, as Mona sat by the window, she felt a small flicker of hope. It wasn't the kind of hope that came from dreams of escape or promises of a better life. It was a kind of hope born from action, from the belief that change, however small, was possible. Maryjane's memory lived on, not just in the stories Mona shared, but in the lives of the women who found the courage to fight back. She had been a dreamer, a fighter, and though her story ended in tragedy, it sparked a movement that refused to be silenced. And in that, Maryjane finally found her freedom. Months after her death, the ripples of her story began to grow. Mona's letters had reached people who cared, journalists, human rights organizations, and activists who were outraged by the systemic exploitation of women like Maryjane. Investigations were launched and whispers of justice grew louder. For the first time in years, the house that once felt like a prison began to feel like it had a purpose beyond survival. One evening, a young journalist named Akin knocked on the door of the house. Mona answered hesitantly, unsure of whether to trust him. He introduced himself with an earnestness that disarmed her. "I've been following your letters," he said, holding a folder filled with articles and notes. "I want to tell your story, Maryjane's story." Mona hesitated. She had spent so long trying to protect herself and the women in the house from the dangers of exposure. But something about Akin's sincerity made her pause. "This isn't just my story," she said finally. "It's all of ours. And if we do this, it has to be the truth, the whole truth." The women gathered around the small table that night, sharing their story with Akin. Goldie, usually guarded, opened up about the betrayal that had led her to Italy. Joyce spoke of the family she hadn't seen in years and the guilt that weighed heavily on her. Mona, her voice steady but full of emotion, recounted Maryjane's dream and her tragic end. Through their words, Maryjane's spirit seemed to fill the room, her memory a powerful reminder of why they were fighting. Akin listened intently, taking notes but never interrupting. When they finished, he promised them, "I'll make sure the world hears you." Over the next few weeks, Akin worked tirelessly to piece together their stories in a powerful expose. The article titled "Dreams in Chains: The Hidden Lives of Trafficked Women" was published in a prominent newspaper. It painted a vivid picture of their struggles, their courage, and the system that had failed them. Maryjane's name was at the heart of it, her story a symbol of both tragedy and resilience. The article sparked outrage. Protests erupted across the city, and international organizations began to take notice. The authorities, under pressure from the public, launched raids on known trafficking networks. Soji, along with several others, were arrested, his empire of exploitation crumbling under the weight of exposure. Back at the house, the women began to feel the first breaths of freedom. For the first time, they were visited by social workers who offered them a way out, safe housing, vocational training, and the chance to rebuild their lives. It wasn't an immediate solution, but it was a great start. Mona, however, couldn't bring herself to leave just yet. She stayed behind, determined to help other women who might find themselves in the same situation. The house became a haven, a place where dreams could be nurtured instead of destroyed. With the support of activists and donations from around the world, it was transformed into a shelter named after Maryjane. 1 year after Maryjane's death, the women gathered at the shelter for a memorial. They lit candles in her honor, their faces illuminated by the soft glow. Mona stood in the center, holding the sketch Maryjane had drawn of the house surrounded by flowers. "Maryjane dreamed of a life beyond this walls," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "And though she's not here to see it, her dream lives in on us." As they stood in the silence, the room filled with a sense of purpose. Maryjane's story had sparked change, not just for them, but for countless others who now had a chance to dream without fear. And in the light of those candles, her spirit shone brighter than ever. The shelter grew steadily, becoming more than just a refuge for women escaping the horrors of trafficking. It became a symbol of hope, a place where people could dream and be mended and new ones could take root. Mona, once uncertain and burdened by guilt, emerged as a leader. Her resilience inspired others, and her unwavering dedication to Maryjane's memory kept her going even on the hardest days. One afternoon, as Mona walked through the shelter's small garden, a space they had built with donated seeds and soil, she stopped to admire the roses that had begun to bloom. Maryjane had always loved flowers, their quiet beauty and ability to thrive even in harsh conditions. Mona smiled faintly, feeling a connection to her late friend that was both comforting and bittersweet. A young woman named Chika approached her hesitantly, clutching a notebook to her chest. She had arrived at the shelter only a few weeks earlier, her eyes haunted by memories she refused to share. "Mona," she began softly, "can I show you something?" Mona nodded and Chika opened her notebooks to reveal pages with sketches, just like Maryjane's. "Before everything happened," Chika whispered, "I used to dream of being a designer," she admitted. "Before everything happened. But I don't think it's possible now." Mona placed a hand on her shoulder. "It is possible." Maryjane had the same dream, and while she didn't get the chance to live it out, that doesn't mean you can't. We'll find a way to make that happen. One evening, as Mona sat in her office reviewing the shelter's finances, a call came in from Aki. "Mona," he said, his voice carrying a hint of excitement, "I have news. A foundation wants to support the shelter. They are offering funding to expand your work, and they are asking if you'll be willing to speak at their annual gala." Mona hesitated. The idea of standing in front of a crowd both daunting and exhilarating. "I'm not sure I'm the right person for that," she admitted. "You are," Akin insisted. "You've built something incredible here, Mona. People need to hear your story, Maryjane's story." On the night of the gala, Mona stood backstage, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched a small note card. She had rehearsed her speech dozens of times, but the weight of the moment pressed heavily on her chest. When her name was called, she stepped onto the stage, the bright lights making it hard to see the faces in the audience. She took a deep breath and began, "Good evening. My name is Mona, and I am here today because of a woman who dared to dream." Her voice steadied as she recounted Maryjane's story, her journey, her struggles, and the legacy she had left behind. She spoke of the shelter, the women it had helped, and the resilience they had shown. By the time she finished, the room was silent, a collective air hanging in the air. When the applause finally came, it was thunderous. Tears filled Mona's eyes as she stepped down from the stage, overwhelmed by the support and validation. That night, the foundation pledged to fund the expansion of the shelter, ensuring that even more women could find safety and hope. Years later, the shelter had grown into a network with branches across the country. Maryjane's name became a beacon of hope for women who had been silenced and oppressed. Though Maryjane was gone, her dream lived on, in every stitch sewn by the women who had been saved, in every story told, and in every life rebuilt. Her spirit lingered, a quiet but powerful reminder that even in the darkest places, hope could take root and flourish. Thank you so much for watching. If this story touched you, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with others. Your support helps spread these vital messages and inspire change. Until next time, have a great one.